The year 1962 ruptured the exclusionary worlds of French Algeria. The mass departure of soldiers, colonizers, settlers left a country dotted with urban settlements whose origins are fortifications, bivouacs, defensive redoubts, tented military camps, regroupment camps, and garrison cities. The understudied history of the Algerian War Memorial belongs to the much-studied scholarly history surrounding France's post-World War I monuments. For historian Antoine Prost, constructing monuments on a grand scale in France to commemorate fallen soldiers emerged from horrifically elevated numbers of some 1,300,000 French dead in World War I. Among those who fought for France were 343,000 conscripted and mobilized Algerians, divided according to colonial categories between French citizens and indigènes, the latter referring to Muslims drafted as French subjects. Prost understands the origins of localized war memorials as mass-produced sites, substituting bereavement practices for families obliged to mourn absent physical bodies buried on distant lands and distant battlefields. So widespread were war memorials and what's called the cult of the monument throughout Europe that the term statuomania was coined by Maurice Aguillon to account for 36,000 interwar memorials throughout France and its overseas territories, including Algeria. French Algeria ended in 1962 after 132 years as a colony and settler colony. The fate of French-built war memorials in Algeria inadequately reflects the passions and violence surrounding the 7-year brutal War of Independence from 54 to 62 and the resulting mass exodus of over 1 million European former settlers. Large numbers of monuments and statues fabricated in France or in Algeria, which had either migrated to or been constructed in Algeria during the French colonial era, flowed back across the Mediterranean Sea. Now, the word used to express this post-1962 south to north trajectory is repatriate, rapatrier in French. It best exemplifies a major underlying problem, which is that France and Algeria have widely diverging definitions of the word repatriation, let alone of the mechanisms for redress and restitution. For Algeria, repatriation aligns closely with the United Nations interpretations, focusing on the material history currently residing in France and demands for artifact returns to Algeria. In referencing the destroyed and removed material, Algerian archivists use the term memoriacide, which they've borrowed, including killing memory, from the 1990s Balkan Wars and the destruction of the libraries and cultural heritage of Sarajevo. In the case of the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Court prosecuted for the first time the ruination of libraries, records, and cultural sites as crimes against humanity. Emotional intensity, absence of archives, absence of information, and comparative cases have fueled contentious disputes between Algeria and France since then. The controversy remains ongoing because, in part, Algerian archivists do not know what happened to all the archives, where they are, or who even has them. This, in turn, has conjured an imaginary warehouse of materials, a warehouse that opposing sides insist that the other possesses and has willfully occluded. For Algerians, the former French colonial era archives of Algeria await their repatriation by means of the north to south voyage homeward. In striking contrast are French approaches. Objects transported across the sea were done in coordination with the French military, but also by a community which could have been designated as exiles, refugees, even immigrants. Instead, French law assigned them the category repatriated from Algeria, rapatrié d'Algérie. Phrases defined by law, December 26, 1961, to encompass trans-Mediterranean mobilities of people that were then extended to objects. It's inexact, and these are the categories of the repatriated here. For the French, along with tons of artifacts and archives, 1 million people resettled archives, objects, and peoples south to north. Most writings in France about public art removed from Algeria use this word rapatrié. I was recently at a conference last week here in France, and the term that is used is repatriated archives. But it hides economic processes and complex transnational circuits that dismantled, packed, and transported large works from Algeria to a presumed place of origin in France, where they were installed in new sites of colonial memory in France. The impetus justifying this so-called, I put it in quotes always, repatriation, drew on several conditions: a major geopolitical rupture, a belief in the threat of the monument's imminent destruction, and the capacity and the will to transport these items elsewhere. During the early days of Algerian independence, in fact, a year before and a year after were the most moments I found, the French Army Engineering Corps selectively dismantled relevant war memorials, transferred them to the port of Marseille, and they were warehoused in this city. There was then followed by a slow dispersal by the military to regional depots that were linked to the war monument or the person in sculpted form. This was undertaken without consulting the provisional Algerian government before independence, nor were such wholesale removals considered a possibility under the recently concluded Evian Accords that led to Algerian independence. My focus is on military settlements, what are called in French ville caserne, because they bookend the French 1830 conquest and the 1962 Algerian independence. And this is the town of Sidi Bel Abbès in Algeria. From this town emerged legends about imperial fighting forces, namely the French Foreign Legion, a world in sculpture and architecture that was built through the military grid of counterinsurgency. The Legion and Algerian towns like Sidi Bel Abbès, Saïda, there are many others, were so deeply intertwined that settler colonial histories emphasized their unique creation as if from nothing, ex nihilo, sprung up like many sites whose founding myths perennially imagined Algeria as terra nullius, nobody's land. Hence, the space of conquest, expropriation, native expulsion, and settler implantation in the mid-1850s. Here in the Mekera Valley, the nexus of army supply routes for military penetration southward, a settler colonial world was ordered, as many 19th century French Algerian settler towns were, according to their establishment as military installations, and only then were they demarcated into civilian spaces. There was a central square surrounded by a church, tribunal, post office, school, town hall, prison, monument. After World War I, main squares became sites in France and French Algeria to commemorate the dead through war memorials. The significance of implanting these monuments was well understood by the native Algerian population. Frantz Fanon famously linked colonial Algeria, known for a plethora of monuments, to materialize expressions of colonial power and occupation. And I won't read you the quote. For Sidi Bel Abbès, a post-World War I memorial was erected in 1931, just 1 year after the 1930 centennial festivities that feted a century of French colonial rule. Built for the French Foreign Legions by sculptor Charles Pouquet, it was a grandiose monument to the dead, an impressive rectangular cenotaph base measuring 30 by 23 feet, no idea what this is in your measurements, supporting a 20-foot, it's really high, bronze globe, double it, okay, decorated with patches of gold for countries depicting the Legion's engagement. The globe, resting on a grand onyx pedestal, which came from Algeria's famous quarries, depict the legion's engagement. It's framed by 4 legionnaires sculpted in bronze, representing 4 emblematic martial epochs: the legion's 1830-40 Algerian conquest, their Mexican campaigns, later colonial battles in France, in Algeria and elsewhere, and of course World War I. Much like the entire edifice of French Algeria, the oversized work of pedestal, globe, inscription, ancillary decorations, and 4 soldiers was intended to be monumental. Charles Pourquet's sculpture was planned for permanence. Notwithstanding storied combat histories represented by their globe, the French Foreign Legion was obliged to leave their Algerian home base in Sidi Bel Abbès. The Evian Accords, regulating the ends of the Algerian War and Algerian independence, stipulated the removal of the French army from most, but not all, of the and that's the key point, of the territory of an independent Algeria by July 5th, 1962. On September 29th, 1962, several months later, the last stones of the dismantled monument, each carefully numbered and labeled, were loaded onto trucks for shipment across the Mediterranean to Marseille. Recalling his last day 50 years later, in 2002, Albéric Vaillant, who was then a legionnaire colonel, concludes, and that's the end of the sentence here, and it was done admittedly clandestinely, that the Legion left nothing behind. His account, saturated with symbolic and emotional violence, accompanies the Legion's final acts of destruction and illegal transfer. A last night of celebration was crowned by ritualistic conflagration. Soldiers set up an impromptu funeral pyre on the emptied monument platform. They drank, they gave speeches, they mourned, and they burned. And here's my rough English translation. All the war memorials were recovered, including, of course, the boule, the ball, the world. This was the most difficult. The concrete base was incredibly hard. It took 10 days, many pickaxes, for the brave pioneers to make a clean sweep. The evening before, wood was piled on the site of the disappeared monument. It was set on fire. After that, they danced all night, put on battle dress at dawn. In front of the last square, the orders for the day by the general were read. The trucks advanced in what had been, the legionnaire had a sacred way there. The colonel's jeep in the rear, and the convoy rolled to Oran, where the battalion commander waited him for the crossing. Thanks to Admiral Laurin, who was, we're talking about the top of the military, who had faked, in fact, added was the term they used, the stated tonnage to 2 clandestine boat trips, the Legion left nothing behind. The day the Legion left, and I interviewed many people who certainly remember that in Sidi Bel Abbès, especially Jalloul Talha. He's the founding president of an Algerian NGO dedicated to preserving the colonial heritage of Sidi Bel Abbès, which is one of my questions. Why would Algerians, and how, more how, but also I get to the why sometimes. Why are they preserving French colonial heritage? It's not for tourists, and it's for themselves, since tourism is minimal in Algeria. He, too, remembered the nocturnal bonfires, the iconoclastic acts that lit up the town core. He said to me, Algerians in colonial terms, we were indigènes. We assumed the Legion was burning and destroying their barracks, in fact, the whole town. The center of Sidi Bel Abbès was the most segregated place, and we Algerians rarely entered. Sometimes a progressive French teacher brought us on a school trip, on a tour. We were happy to see the Legion go. This was a garrison town, a military town, and therefore an automatic occupation of Algerians. Another person I interviewed said, we do not walk about the European town. We were immediately driven back to the indigenous native quarter. It was another spatial discrimination. The indigenous Muslim population I'm using colonial terms, inhabited segregated enclaves, the colonizer forcibly separating from the colonized, reinforced in ville-caserne by topography and military walls. As in Algeria's second largest city of Oran, this was called, here in Sidi Bel Abbès, it was called El Graba. The native section was labeled always Ville Nègre, Negro town, black town. The Legion's last days were viewed from the native space that comprised what were two towns in one, each regulated according to the reciprocal exclusivity famously described by Frantz Fanon. After Algerian independence, the Legion's globe was displaced to its new headquarters here in Aubagne, just outside Marseille, where it resides to this day, while in Sidi Bel Abbès, Algeria, the space at the center of a military complex became an empty parade ground where the post-1962 Gendarmerie School took over intact the Legion's buildings. Now, the community of former European settlers, now predominantly residing in France, are what consider themselves iconodules, is the word in art history, meaning they see themselves as saving and protecting the monumental legacies of French Algeria. When I interview them, they tell me about the removal of statues from Algeria, and they do it through the morality and agency of statues. They tell me, yes, it was smuggled without the new Algerian state's knowledge, but it needed French protection to survive. Or they say to me, no, it was not smuggled because it doesn't belong to Algeria, but, for example, to the French Foreign Legions. Art historians, anthropologists, scholars have weighed in too. Some see statues, the technical term in art history is spolia, defined as components of sculpture taken from one location and reused elsewhere. But our art historians themselves continue to disagree about things like ethical provenance, is the term, in relation to layers of conquest and removal as a rite of artistic renewal. Spolia and spoliation were practiced famously throughout the ancient Mediterranean when ancient Greek or Roman artifacts were incorporated into medieval structures. It continues as a pervasive artistic formation into the present and has been defined as artistic, the term is reuse, by one of the foremost art historians, Arnold Esch. He describes this transformation as death, not death, but rather new life, new agency, a new adventure. He was a turn-of-the-century German art historian. Counter-arguments currently, and so there is a difference in 100 years, by American art historian Dale Kinney, calls for considering the entire process, and here it's close to what David's working on, removal, transport, and reuse, if ideologically driven or commercially driven, or even labeling objects as booty, if requiring a great deal of effort. She concludes that such objects are survivors of violence about which they might be mute if they bear no visible signs of it, or they might be eloquent. In turn, Esch would see the transported Algerian Legionnaire monument as possessing revitalized life and agency in its new French home, while for Kinney, such objects fall into the category of stolen objects, spoliated. So, what an anthropology of art can tease out, and that's my field, are topics such as when are artifact removals considered a form of spoliation, undertaken in haste, undertaken in despair, but based on colonial possession. If these removals from Algeria are acts of looting or pillage, does the time frame matter? Since wholesale removals were not envisioned by the treaties, but were started a year before the treaties. I've interviewed everybody who's still alive in this picture, and you'll hear more about it next. And so I'm going to conclude with a few more questions. Does a statue possess an original home, a rootedness in a site? To whom does it matter when and how it gets moved? Are war memorials sacred? And special objects, are they, quote, repatriable, like human beings were? These questions continue to be raised about ownership and possession, metropolitan provenance versus colonial implantation, French colonial memory, and nostalgie is the term that's used here. In the context of former French Algeria, ongoing disputes related to colonial art, artifacts from Algeria in French museums, archives from Algeria in French archives, highlight theoretical, affective, and historical arguments, but they also serve as symbolic and, of course, very real proxies for unresolved claims against the former French colonial state over crimes its agents perpetrated during its conquest and rule in Algeria. Thank you.